Here we go. All the way. Gotta be rough and tough. Bo dilly, have you heard? Bo dilly, have you heard? We're gonna jump from a big iron bird. We're gonna jump from a big iron bird.
Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you to today's latest show in our series, Today's Veteran. And we are here with Mr. Murray Baxter at the Southland Suites in Lakeland. And Mr. Baxter is a surviving member of the attack at Pearl Harbor in, of course, World War II. And we want to talk with Mr. Baxter today and bring our viewing audience, and especially the younger members of our viewing audience, some first-hand information from a gentleman who was on the battleship USS California when the attack occurred at Pearl Harbor. We are here also with his wife of 61 years, Sammy, and she's off camera, but she's watching us and keeping an eye on Murray to make sure that he gives the whole story. So without further ado, we'll get into our interview with Murray. Murray, welcome.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure
to
be here with you, one of our World War II veterans and heroes that live right here in Polk County. And tell us a little bit, Murray, if you would, about we want to go back to 1940 when you enlisted. I think it was in August of 1940, and you went to training in San Diego at the naval facility there. But tell us a little bit about the world at that time in general.
Well, at that time, I had just graduated from high school in El Centro, California, which is 120 miles due east of San Diego, over the mountains, down in the desert, down close to the Salton Sea and the Gulf of Lower California, only 8 or 10 miles from the Mexican border. At that time, the Depression was really coming in, and there were many men with families at that time, as I recall, as a young lad out of school, that were having difficulty supporting their families. Now, to emphasize that is that my father was in the hardware business downtown El Centro, and he, through the friends of his and the influence in San Diego, got me a job before I graduated from high school, delivering the San Diego Union newspaper to the subscribers in and around the city of El Centro. And I delivered them on my bicycle. But there was 2 men who constantly pestered my father for my job. They could support their family on the $18 a week that I cleared. And they let me know about it. But that was my first experience with the wages and things that went on, the coming of the Depression.
Now, of course, in 1940, in terms of world events, the war in Europe had started in 1939, and by August of 1940 had been raging for almost a year. Hitler, of course, had invaded Poland, and in 1940 he also overtook the Low Countries in France. What was the feeling in this country at that time, but prior to Pearl Harbor?
I find that difficult to answer because at our age, in other words, myself and like people, we were not kept up on that. We didn't read the paper and obtain from it the full potential. And it's like right now, I'm assisting you today with the strong belief in the back of my mind that we have too many young men in America today who don't understand what we're talking about. A good example of that is that Sammy and I were invited to go to, what was the name of town? Auburndale? We went to Auburndale at the request of a Navy man over there who was training the junior ROTC students And when I got over there, when Sam and I both got over there, I learned that he had young girls in ROTC as well as boys, which surprised me. But when I got to talking to them and let them ask questions, they could interrupt and ask questions, it became evident to me that they were hungry for information about that period in our lives. But nobody, in no way was there any system for them to find out about it. So I did my best to teach them that. Now, another thing, when we drove, she and I, when we drove over to Auburndale, one of the things that she asked me, she says, honey, you don't have any notes to read from, you don't have any cards to read from, you don't have anything prepared? I says, no. If you went through what I went through, you'll remember every second of it.
Mm-hmm.
And as we talk about it, it comes up and up and up and up. It's just like it just goes on and on and on.
Well, I think that in 1940, and of course prior to Pearl Harbor, there was a fairly strong isolationist movement in the United States. You know, people that had the experience of the First World War, and they saw what was going on in Europe, and they, you know, they thought that we could be protected by our two oceans, and, you know, why should we get involved?
May I interject something?
Sure.
One of my recollections was at that time, before I enlisted in the Air Force, in the Navy, that so many people were against Roosevelt and his wanting to assist the English people.
Right, that's exactly right.
And that's what was coming up.
Lend-Lease was one thing in particular.
Yeah. And so many people were against that. But the poor British were being bombed out of this whole nation, or the whole world, by the Germans. There were so many attacks coming across the English Channel on London and those towns that
well, I think you know, to put it into perspective, England was absolutely standing alone with their backs to the wall. France had been knocked out of the war. Mm-hmm. Italy was allied with Germany. Germany had signed a non-aggression pact with Russia.
And so they had occupying
the Low Countries.
The Low Countries.
And they had a free hand, and England was in extremely desperate straits.
Very definitely.
So getting back to your duty then, you completed your training at San Diego, and you were assigned to the USS California, which of course was one of the famous battleships that was at Pearl. Was the fleet then at that time at San Diego?
No, no. Let me tell you, when all of us in this company of recruits going through San Diego got finished with our training, we were moved over to North Island and placed on board the USS Saratoga for a trip to Honolulu. We knew we were going to Honolulu. So that was a good experience. We got on the Saratoga. She left the Bay of San Diego, went around Point Loma, and on over to Hawaii. It was, as I remember, it was a 5 or 6 day trip. But most of us spent up topside on the flight deck of the aircraft carrier because they weren't landing and taking off any aircraft during that time. They had 500 or 600 of us on that aircraft carrier. Now, when Diamond Head come into sight, we all got up topside to see Diamond Head. And lo and behold, they anchored the Saratoga just off Diamond Head, just outside of the surf. And we had only been there a while after they had dropped anchor when they lowered their Liberty boats and took all of us down into the Liberty boats, and we went around and went over the entrance to Pearl Harbor, and there was the ships lined up along Ford Island. And in those days, we were carrying our sea bags, our hammocks, our mattresses, our blankets, and anything else we owned.
All your worldly possessions.
All our worldly possessions. And you'd go down a ladder on an aircraft carrier to get in a little boat that's blowing up and down with that on your shoulder. They warn you and caution you, we don't have any hooks long enough to get you out of the bottom. Mm-hmm. So you didn't fall.
So so your ship, of course, was the California.
Right.
And do you remember about the day or the month that you first stepped foot on the California?
I don't recall. I recall it, but I don't have no recollection of what date or what it.
Well, how many months were you there prior to the actual attack? About?
Well, that's hard to say because the battle fleet was going in and out constantly, training.
Mm-hmm.
We thought nothing of all of leaving the harbor and going out and staying out a week to 2 weeks. But they were all ships of the fleet that were in line and going like this. Let me ask you a question, since we're on television. A battleship has got 6 float pontoon airplanes on top of the main battery.
Mm-hmm.
And they're launched with a catapult.
Right.
How are those airplanes recovered?
By crane. They have these cranes that they
snatch them out of midair.
They snatch them out of midair.
No, I'm asking you.
No, they were float planes, so they would land in the water, and they had a hooking device, and they would hook to it and lift them up and put them back in place. Am I right on that?
Well, that's pretty close. What I'm trying to get at is, though, that water in the Pacific Ocean around the Hawaiian Islands can be pretty much like this.
Oh, yes, very choppy.
Over 1 and under 2, not a battleship, but a lot of ships. No, when a captain wants to recover his aircraft in the air, from the air, the first thing he does, he makes a right turn or a left turn, and he makes it sharp, way out, routed. You know why? Because the wake of the ship of that great big battleship, smooths the ocean out.
Give them a place to land.
And they come in on that thing just like it was gravy, and taxi right up to the side of the ship, and then they're hooked and brought up.
So I think you've made a very good point that I want to draw on a little bit to our audience that's watching this. I think there may be a misconception that the battle fleet that was moved to the Hawaiian Islands and was anchored at Pearl Harbor was not there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, but in and out on maneuvers constantly. But the Japanese had spies at Pearl Harbor who were tracking the movements of the fleet and knew when the ships were going and coming, keeping an eye on it through the Japanese consulate at Pearl Harbor. So they knew when the fleet was going and when the fleet was coming and when it would be there.
If that was a true statement, they would have known that the aircraft carriers were out of the harbor.
Well, they did know it. I mean, they knew it. They knew it
when they saw that they weren't in that water.
They knew it. They got a late message, the attacking fleet did, that the carriers were not there. So here again, just to bring it up to today's date and to tie it in, you know, we have enemies today on our own soil, terrorists, who are watching and making note. We had the same thing back then, the enemies of this country. So, okay, so we're at Pearl, you're on the California. Tell us a little bit about duty on a battleship.
Well, that's quite easy. You were never in the Navy, were you? Okay. The recruits, like I was, when we went aboard the USS California. Now remember, the Saratoga took a whole bunch of us over there. So we were all split up and went to different ships, not necessarily battleships.
Right.
We went to different ships. I was fortunate enough to get the USS California. But when you go aboard a ship like that, the first thing you're going to do is get into some training and learning how to paint and chip paint, scrub decks, and everything else. But you also learn how to find the depth of the water underneath the keel of the ship, but with a lead sounding device that you stand out on a little platform the side of the ship. You learn to scrub your own clothes in the head. Does anybody know what a head is?
Yes, bathroom.
He's a Marine.
Yes.
It's the bathroom in the Navy. in the Marine Corps is called a head. And it's up in the very bow of the ship, where the ship comes down like this, but underneath the top deck. And it's tiled. The floor and the walls are tiled. But that's the way it was. You scrubbed your clothes up there, and then you took the clothes that you got clean out of your galvanized bucket, threw away the soapy water on the floor because it just drained out. You took it topside and tied it to the lifelines with little pieces of rope. And that little piece of rope about this long has got a copper or a brass ring around it to keep it from coming out. You know, it was twisted like a rope is. And that way you tied it to the line so that the wind and the weather caused the clothing that you owned and your socks and undershirts and skivvies and things like that to dry.
That's a washer and dryer Navy style.
That's a washer and dryer Navy style.
Mm-hmm.
Now, an interesting thing I'd like to tell everybody about is that in addition to that, we had to paint the anchor chains. The anchors in the bow of the ship come up like this through a hole in the deck. And they hung right slap against the big old anchor chains, against the metal outside. But the chains come up and through and went down towards the big guns. But those big chains, links were about this high and about that long. If they were single, you couldn't pick them up. They were so heavy. But those chains ran on, you see these toolboxes on the back of these pickup trucks? They call them diamond material.
Right.
Well, the track that those chains went on the deck of the battleship were diamond impregnated. It was visible. And when they wound that windlass up and brought that chain up out of the bottom of the ocean and brought it up alongside into the ship where it nestled, that chain went along there and went back down inside the ship to storage. But there was a windlass, a powered windlass that brought that up. It wasn't human power, it was electrical power. But now that anchor chain had to be sanded, wire brushed, scraped, and repainted 2 or 3 times before the captain agreed to pass it, let it go. But one thing I want to get to you is the word holy stone. Mean anything to any of you? Holy stone. It's pretty religious sounding, but it isn't religious at all. The top deck of the USS California and the other battleships is made out of teak wood. You can't get teak wood anymore. You can't get it anymore. It's too expensive. So we had to sand those teak floors, decks, that were topside out in the visible weather. Now those, you'll see them on some of these fancy speeders, boats out here in the ocean that people got enough money to buy.
Right.
They've got caulking between each one. It's a white caulking and the rest of it is teak. Well, to keep that wooden deck polished the way that everybody wanted it, on a certain day of the month or the week, the chief boatswain's mate would get sand out of the sand deck down below. There's a place for the wet sand to be stored just for the purpose of polishing those decks. You take it by the bucket, and they'd bring the bucket up, and it was wet. The sand was still wet, and they would throw it, sand it, across the deck like this, back and forth. And then they'd call us up to polish them, which is holy stoning. We would stand in a line with our back to the side of the ship, the lifeline.
Right.
If we went backwards, we'd fall overboard, but we didn't, of course. We lined up there. And the chief boatswain mate would come along and give us a broomstick. A broomstick. The broomstick had the broom cut off of it. So it was a long stick, about yay long. This end down here where the broom was is square, 90 degrees to the length of the broom. This end up here is rounded off because that's the way it comes from the factory. It's smooth. It doesn't have any square corners, and the whole thing is round. Then they give you a brick like you and I know a brick. a red brick like this. But they've got a hole in the center of it that doesn't go all the way through it. It goes about halfway through, and it's been dug out. So once the sand is on this deck, they take a hose and they lightly spray it. And you're still standing there, but you've got this broomstick in your hand. When it comes time, you take that broomstick and turn it over, and you put that rounded end in the hole of that brick that's right in front of you on a strip of teak wood. And when they give you the word, now you've got buddies standing right beside you, elbow to elbow. When they give you the word to start, then you put your hand around that and this broomstick up here, and you're holding it down here, and you're holding it real close, and you go 1, 2, 1, 2. The chief boatswain's counting. Nobody else is counting but him, and he's watching you. 1, 2, and after so many steps, he says, "Okay, move down 1 and move up 1." So you go clear across.
It's the Navy's version of a waltz.
Yeah, yeah. But it's a lot of work.
Yes.
Especially at that hour of the morning. I didn't tell you what hour it was. It's just barely sunrise.
Yeah, right.
And it's about time for breakfast.
Yeah.
Well,
some of that good Navy chow.
Yeah, those beans.
Uh-huh.
The Navy beans. Believe me, I couldn't believe it.
Navy beans.
Yeah, I couldn't believe it.
Okay, so tell us a little bit. Let's bring it up to the weekend of December the 7th, which of course the attack actually occurred at 7:55 a.m. But what were you doing that weekend, say on Saturday?
Well, in the Navy you can't go ashore on Liberty unless you're in the Liberty class. They put it port and starboard, this or that. They go, you're the 1st Division, 2nd Division, this and that. So this is your Liberty Day. Or when you first come into port, you want to go ashore. Well, if you're not eligible for Liberty that day, you don't go ashore. Well, that December the 7th was a Sunday, and very few sailors were eligible to go ashore that day. But most of the officers and some of the other technicians did go ashore because they had families in Honolulu and on the island of Oahu. But as far as I was concerned, at that time I had been promoted because I wanted to work in the captain's office. I wanted to become a yeoman in the Navy. This is what's known as a striker. You go through, if you want to become a radioman, if you want to become an engineer down in the...
You strike for that particular position.
That trade.
Right.
Yeah, if you want to be a mechanic, you'd go, or if you want to be a gunner's mate, you go into the guns and do that. Well, that morning, I was in the C Division, down on the 3rd deck, below the main deck. Had just gotten out of my bunk, and there was a locker there, belonged to me, and I was putting my clothes on. But except that at that time, I didn't have my shoes on, but I did have socks on, with the idea that I was going to go to the head. And I was getting everything ready to go down to the head and shave and all of that. When the loudspeaker sounded, I'm going to tell all of you exactly what it sounded like to me. There are no telephones on a ship at sea, as we know telephones like around here. They are called sound-powered telephones. They are, the transmission of the voice across the wires is done by sound, and it works. It doesn't depend on electricity to keep it operating.
Right.
Over the loudspeaker came a voice, and it said, "All hands, man your battle stations. All hands, man your battle stations. This is not a drill." And the bugle was sounding, and the officer of the deck we knew was out there. This was a Marine on duty on the quarterdeck with the officer of the day. And he's come over this loudspeaker constantly. "All hands, man your battle stations. All hands, man your battle stations. This is not a drill." And you could tell by the tone of the man's voice that he was close to being frightened. Well, so were we. Now, on a ship in the Navy, you've got certain rules and regulations on the ship as you have on the state highway. You go one direction or the other direction. On a battleship, you go aft on the port side and you go forward on the starboard side. So beneath the ship, inside the interior of the ship, you go down until you can find a cross connection over here, and then you go that way. And then you start going up and down ladders. In the very center of the ship is a group of ladders that cross this way, just like this. One goes up and one goes down. Well, all ladders go up and down, believe me. But this was the midship hatch, exactly. And everything that needed to went up or down that hatch. Now, I'll come to that later on, but it's very, very important that you know that that hatch is there. So I took off, moving very fast, and went down. But every compartment in the Navy is like a wall in this building, except that it's got a hatch vertical in it. But to get to that door, you have to go up 2 or 3 steps and unlock it. There's knobs, they're brass knobs, you unscrew it, and it allows it to swing open. And you swing it open, and you walk through, and that lets everybody else walk through. And then,
Murray,
yes.
I'm going to have to interrupt you.
All right.
I know that this has been very, very interesting, and I'm sure the audience wants to hear more, and we've got a lot more to talk about. We've been talking with Mr. Murray Baxter, who is a Pearl Harbor survivor who was on board the USS California when the attack actually occurred. And Murray has been telling us about shipboard life and bringing us up to the attack. Next month, we're going to, in our second segment of this program, we will talk to Murray about the actual events of the attack and then what his duty was subsequently during World War II. Murray, it's been fascinating, and I thank you so much for allowing us to talk to you today.
Well, thank you very much.
Yes, sir.
I'm very happy to do it.
Okay.
Thank you all.
Here we go, all the way, gotta be, rough and tough, bo dilly, have you heard? Bo dilly, have you heard? We're gonna jump from a big iron bird. We're gonna jump from a big iron bird. Stand up, hook up, shuffle to the door. Stand up, hook up, shuffle to the door. When you leap right out and count to 4.
Very own Bowflex